Yeah, in the steering committee meeting, we felt that we didn't have enough space yesterday to kind of finish our discussion about the democracy, autocracy, and sustainable development links. And I would like to start to say that I really feel sorry for the wording I choose when I choose the Africa example. And I didn't mean to offend anybody with this. I'm happy anybody who felt offended, come up and we talk about it bilaterally in a group, whatever suits you best. At the same time, I still stand behind the evidence that we presented yesterday. And I think it's a pity that we ended up in and I think our presentation, the way we put it, was conducive to that we ended up in an either-or democracy, autocracy discussion, because that wasn't the point. The point is rather any country, wherever it is located in this world, is in between that spectrum, autocracy, democracy. It's situated somewhere, there's a high diversity, and we can measure that diversity. That was one of the main messages, and there's a lot to say about it and to discuss, and we thought that it would be a good idea to host a webinar, like 2 hours, where we discuss this and where we can bring in all the ideas that we couldn't discuss and also the voices and opinions in the room to discuss these issues. So we'll come up with a proposition for a date and happy to see many of you there. Thanks.
Well, thank you for that, Julia, and more information will be forthcoming on that webinar. But now it is my pleasure to sort of kick off the first of the plenary discussions that we're going to use to close off the conference. And so I'd like to invite Franziska Piontek from PIC to start us off with her presentation on integrated scenarios with impacts, mitigation, and adaptation.
Yeah, thank you very much. I was tasked to review a little bit the current status of integrated scenarios, what is available and how to move forward. And I want to stress that I'm an integrated assessment modeler, and I look at this from a rather global perspective. So if you have other more national perspectives, I invite you to voice those afterwards if you feel they don't get enough attention in this presentation here. I may not have to do this, but just to start us off, I would like to motivate again why we should really do integration. And I think it's pretty evident that when we look at a lot of the also very influential studies and outputs of our work, we look at rather negative effects of mitigation. We look at costs. We look at distributional effects which burden the poor most, like in the middle example. We look at effects on SDGs, and we have to think about how do we mitigate these negative effects. And what we miss in a lot of these discussions and papers is really, well, why are we doing this? What are the benefits of the mitigation? And there's always sort of a sentence somewhere in the discussion, yeah, the shortcoming is we don't have impacts. And we should really go beyond that. Two other small motivations would be that impacts can, of course, have an effect on the mitigation strategy. They can have an effect on the water, energy, and land use systems, and that may change how the mitigation pathway will work. And there is a clear user demand for that, especially, for example, in their work with the Network for Greening the Financial System, who want to look at the integrated physical and transition risks. And we have sort of a hard time meeting that demand at this point. You might say that, yeah, we know so little about the impacts, we can't quantify them very well, that's why we can't really do this. But I think it's really clear now, and a lot of you are already taking the step, that there is a lot of information and quantitative input there which can be used. On the biophysical side, we saw the charts with the publications in the SSP-RCP framework where a lot of it is on impacts, and we have the databases provided, for example, by the EasyMap project, by the AgMap project, which also provide in repositories these data for SSP-RCP projections from a number of different impact sectors in sort of a harmonized setting, which can be used, it can be integrated, it can be compared, it can be put into models because it is in a harmonized framework. But also from the top-down side, we have seen a lot of damage function advances. We have the bottom-up derivation of damage functions, for example, from the COACH project, which take up really state-of-the-art impact assessments to do that. And then we have all the empirical work, for example, in the Climate Impact Lab. It takes, of course, it's nothing for the faint of heart to cross this gap, but we should go ahead and do it. And I would like to walk you through 3 levels of integration with a couple of examples there to sort of show what is already being done. The first level of integration I would call alignment. That means that we simply take our mitigation pathways, the mitigation costs and whatever we have there, and we align that with impacts which result along the similar emission or temperature trajectory, and of course with the same socioeconomic settings, so the same SSP. There is no interaction between the two, of course, but you can still provide sort of a joint assessment of them, which is better than leaving it out completely. And the example I would like to show you is a post-processing of impacts, which we do for the NGFS project. We have 3 different integrated assessment models, the Remind, Message, and GCAM model, which provide different mitigation scenarios, which we translate then into global mean temperature pathways. And then we have 2 different ways of aligning impacts. One is to use an aggregate damage function, where we calculate the GDP losses. And the other way is to really take biophysical impacts and align those with, this is work led by Climate Analytics and published in the Climate Impacts Explorer, which is available online. There the idea is to take really biophysical impacts and use this time slicing approach to align climate impact projections we have along given RCP, so from the EasyMap archive in this case, and through the time slicing approach, align those with the specific trajectories we have for the NGFS. There's other work, for example, work by Drouet et al., which follows the same sort of post-processing approach. This can be really used to assess those together, at least, if not interacting. The scenario framework makes this possible. Without it, might be much harder. And you can really look at many different types of impacts, and both economic and biophysical, so that this makes this actually quite nice. But of course, it misses feedback and interaction, and that's why we want to go to the next level of integration, which I would call partial integration. So in that case, you take impacts and you put them in your model, but still give along your chosen policy pathway, your chosen mitigation pathway. So you capture the dynamic effects, you capture effects on investment, you capture effects, depending on what kind of impacts you put in, effects on your mitigation strategy. But however, you do not react to it in a sense that you adjust your mitigation pathway because you anticipate the impact. So it's not an optimal pathway, but you get more dynamics than if you just align the two. A couple of examples for this one. This is work in a CGE context by Xiang et al., which focuses on the US. They take a number of bottom-up empirical estimates for impacts, for example, on the energy, agriculture, and labor. They have direct effects of that. That is just the outcome of the damage function in response to the temperature, and put that in the CGE, and then you get a GDP loss, which is higher or lower than the direct effect, which is what is shown in this graph. And then if you put all sectors together, then again, you get a different effect. So you get feedbacks and interactions between the sectors in this case as well, which of course changes the damage you get. And there's also work here from the Image and GCAM team, published by Zapata et al., where they take effects on energy supply and put that in the models along RCP 6.0 and RCP 2.6, and then they really look how does that affect the model when these different energy supply channels are affected by climate change. I can't go into details of this, also authors are here, I think, so we have to move on. It's just an example, and I invite you to look these examples up, of course. Another example I also invite you to look up came up in our session on integration yesterday by Adriano Vinca. the message model, which is really also sort of a bottom-up approach to putting in water, energy, and land impacts and analyzing them in the context of climate policy and SDGs, which is maybe one of the first times that SDGs, the effects of impacts on SDGs are analyzed in such a modeling framework. And those slides are, of course, available on the IIASA Connect. So the partial integration allows us to capture some dynamics, so that is important. It allows us to include impacts which we have as time series, but for which we don't have a damage function which we might need to have an optimal. It allows us, for example, to close this gap on studying mitigation effects or effects on the mitigation pathway, but it is not a fully integrated version. And so a final step would be then to really do the full integration, meaning we have an anticipation and an optimal pathway. We can do that in two paradigms, the well-known cost-benefit paradigm, but also the least total cost framework, where we combine damages with some sort of mitigation target to sort of hedge against damages which we can't assess. And we can do this with both the simple cost-benefit models and the process-based IAMs. The challenge we have here really is completeness, because we provide an optimal pathway, which always is only optimal for the damages we put in, and this will never be a complete picture of damages, which is harder to make transparent. Very briefly, examples from cost-benefit IAMs. There's a number of them which are now calibrated to the SSPs. And in various ways, and are used for assessments. The nice example, or the nice application of this, is that you can do a large range of sensitivity analysis because they run fairly fast. So that is the top example, work by Van der Wist et al. Using the Mimosa model, varying damage functions, mitigation cost levels, discount rates, and SSPs, and really looking at the different effects. And on the bottom level, we have work by Gazzotti et al. With the RISE 50+ model, where we have a lot of spatial resolution, so a lot of countries resolved, and we can look at mitigation costs and impacts and inequality between countries. On the process-based side, there is the work by Schultes et al. Using the Remind model in the least total cost approach, and finding that including damages compared to a cost-effectiveness approach really changes, especially the near-term mitigation. So it is important to also do the full integration. And then I just want to point out work done in the framework of the COACH project, where there's actually one of the first model intercomparisons using the very new COACH damage function and comparing the outcomes of putting that into the Mimosa, Remind, and Enrich model. That work is still under review, so not available yet. And also here, I would like to draw your attention to work presented in the session yesterday, work by Francesco Colelli, looking at energy demand impacts. This is really interesting because the effects are quite big, because they pick up extreme events. And we can see that this really changes the challenges for mitigation, because these energy demand impacts, so an adaptation in a sense, actually lead to much higher fossil-based capacities being installed, and therefore to a much higher carbon price. And again, you can check out these slides in great detail. So how do we move forward on that? How do we really keep crossing this bridge and maybe making the bridge a little more stable than this? There are a few challenges I would like to point out. The first challenge is really how we deal with adaptation. And I think this came up in a few discussions already in the past days, but I feel like it didn't really have the space it maybe deserves. I think in a lot of projects and in a lot of groups, we want to go in this direction, and it would be great if we could do a common effort to think about what that means. How can we conceptualize and operationalize that in the SSP framework? Can we use SPAs, and what does it mean? Because if we put effort into this now, we have a sort of a harmonized approach, which will help us greatly to analyze the results later. And one question we have to also think about is then, where is this actually modeled? Do we model that in the IAM itself, where we would need some sort of adaptation cost functions, like in work from Enrica Decian already a few years ago? Or is that rather better placed in the impact modeling, on the impact modeling level, where we have potentially the processes much better resolved to look at adaptation, and then in the end we provide just, let's say, 2 different impact pathways, one with and without adaptation to the IAMs. Of course, then that doesn't allow an optimal pathway, it just would be the partial integration, but, and you would still have to associate cost estimates, which is maybe one of the greatest challenges. But I think it's a topic which we really need to think about together with the impact community to be able to have something in the end which we can also use in our models. Another challenge is the uncertainty. I said we know a lot about impacts, and that is true, but there's also still a very large uncertainty. A slightly shocking figure is always this compilation from the cross-working group box on economic impacts from the IPCC, which is only the global economic damage functions, but you see the extremely wide range between especially the top-down, which are the colorful dots on the bottom, and the empirical, the bottom-up and sort of older style damage functions, and the empirical are the green dots. What do we do with this? And also we have, sort of accumulating uncertainty when we go from climate to weather, to physical impacts, to economic damages. How do we deal with these sort of widening distributions? And that is a challenge we have to discuss. What would that mean for when we say we want to provide a baseline with impacts? Well, what do we pick? Do we pick many, or how do we deal with that? How do we communicate this? This is, of course, always a challenge with impacts. Do we really always want to pick the mean, or are there actually not many cases where we are interested in the risks, and also users are more interested in the risks, and we want to really acknowledge the distribution and look at the tails, maybe even especially in global applications, where we want to sort of hedge against these larger impacts? And then a little bit on a side note, are there unaccounted risks which are maybe even big enough to sort of shift in the scenario matrix from one scenario to the other, because there's really a big tipping point, a black swan event, whatever. We should maybe think about that. And the final point, I think, are the question of present day impacts. When you look especially at the empirical damage functions, there has been this study by Diffenbow and Burke, which looks at the temperature increase we're already seeing today, calculates based on that a counterfactual GDP. So how large would the GDP be today if impacts wouldn't already occur? Of course, that is highly dependent on which damage function you assume. But then you can quantify basically a GDP effect we already have today. And I think when we use the SSPs, we of course start from the observed GDPs, which already have damages in them. So we start from sort of 0 and project forward. That's not quite right. And if there's growth rate or persistent impacts from what has already occurred, then we are also missing something. So that's something we should maybe think about on how we deal with that. So three points on how we move forward. First of all, I would really like to encourage you to use the available input and to really do it. I think we should really get away from just having this, impacts are not included, but actually try to include the impacts. And I showed that there is a lot of things we have and we can do, especially with the alignment approach or the combination of integration and alignment. I mean, we can also have some things we put into the model where we have the impact, sort of the entry points for the impacts, and can include them in the model. And then we have maybe others which we can't, like mortality impacts, like biodiversity impacts, for all of which there is some relationship with global mean temperature, some projections already in the literature. So we could align that and in the sort of report on that at least, to say, well, this is the pathway we get, taking into account some dynamic effects from impacts, and along that pathway would additionally have these other effects. Something which came up in one of the sessions yesterday was also this idea of impact selection depending on your use case, depending on what your question is. You might, you don't always need all impacts. You don't have to stress out about saying, but I can't represent this, I can't represent that, but instead we need to think about, well, what is really relevant in our case? Do we care about what are the effects on mitigation? Then certain impacts are just not relevant and we don't have to worry about them. And I think a model intercomparison exercise on impacts would really be helpful to also sort of, as a community, to help us think about how we address many of these questions and to move this forward. Then there should be, and there is already, a lot of activity to facilitate the impacts integration, and there is a few points where that needs to be advanced. We need to understand better economic impacts, and also we need to derive economic impacts. Key points there are the question of persistence and also the question of double counting, when you might want to combine damage functions you have with other sort of sources of impacts. Using the EasyMap data, I mean, this is a resource which is available and should be used, but it also is something which is mostly biophysical, and it would be good to keep translating that into economic impacts, and that is an activity which so far is not exactly happening. And then we had a very interesting session on emulators this morning, and it seems like emulators are one way to really facilitate the link between impacts and IAM scenarios, and that would be great to have also dialogues on that, on how to move that forward. The final point is sort of a feedback, a service back to the impact community. Because they want to use the SSP framework. They are already using the SSP framework, and I'm speaking a bit from the EasyMap perspective now. But what they need and what they are struggling to get is really the appropriate input data to do that. So they need high resolution data, for example, on population and GDP. So that would be great if that would be sort of more easily available. For population, we have it. For GDP, it's difficult. And if we now update the scenarios, we should also think automatically about, well, okay, so how can we provide also the downscale data for the impact community? And then there's other input data used by a lot of these models which are affected by mitigation. So if they want to say we use the SSP RC3 framework and combine SSP3 with different RCPs, then things like the land use pattern, like dam locations, like power generation, different things change in the mitigation scenario, and they would like to take up this change in their modeling, but that input also is not really available. So that is sort of something we're also from our community going back. It would be great to intensify these efforts. And that brings me to my conclusion. This is really a multidisciplinary effort requiring collaboration across communities, and I think that it's nice that there's a number of people also from the EasyMap community here. It would be great if it would be more, and if this would really become a really key effort, so that we take a lot of people to build an actual solid bridge. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Franziska. That was fantastic. I think we'll do a round of questions. So we've got about 5-7 minutes. I see a hand in the middle over there. No, not, okay. In the middle. Baz is going to have a chance to talk.
Hi, thank you. Hélène Benveniste. I was wondering, it seems you mentioned how the EasyMap community seems to be very integrated already. It sounds that from the economic impact side, people who've done a lot of this work, including also in North America, seem to not be as used to working in very large communities such as the one we have here. I was wondering if you had suggestions about how to, I guess, bring all those efforts together, also with respect to the type of work that perhaps has not worked with very MIP project types before. Thank you.
I think there was another hand on that side. No, okay, Buzz, if you want to have your question.
I'm wondering from this body of work that you present here, and how you summarize it in the end between like individual studies doing their work and providing a community service as like another level. And the third level would be where it's a community standard and it needs to be sort of integrated into the community framework somehow. Where you see that line between going from a community service on providing these data, whether there is a need to make anything a community standard, or whether this is basically just, it doesn't have that, it doesn't need to be.
Stefano Battistoni, University of Zurich, Department of Banking and Finance. I have a question regarding further steps of integration. To what extent do you see the feasibility and the desirability of complementing the analysis also with what is coming from Working Group 2, the impacts which are sometimes not very well captured in terms of GDP? So you have been contrasting cost-benefit and least cost, but in both, what is essentially maximizing is eventually is a function of GDP, and we know that that is not very well capturing some of the effects that are highlighted in Working Group 2, which are conflicts, migrations, well-being, all that. So implicitly, what I'm trying to point out is that formulating the problem in this way is per se normative in the sense that is implying that that's the only metric we should be looking at, while the working groups have been raising the point that climate change is a more complex problem than simply GDP optimization. And then I would say that it would be, and I'm not saying this is an easy task, of course, but I think that I was wondering if there is any reflection on how to implement, complement or integrate some of this multi-objective in the further steps of integration. Thank you.
And I think there was a final question here. Yeah, and then I'll hand it back to you.
Yeah, thanks for an interesting talk. This is Alex Ruane from NASAGIS. I wonder if you could comment a little bit more about the fact that kind of down this road, there's always going to be need for more detail. Always could be finer in terms of resolution, always could be more specific in terms of sector and region. So how do we find the edges of that and say this is where the scenario stops, and consider potentially the possibility that there is an additional dimension that when you do a regional study or when you're looking at a regional outcome, you might need a supplementary scenario of some sort rather than all in one. Thank you.
Let's answer, and then I'll open up for another round.
Okay, yeah, thanks for the interesting questions. On the first question on how to bring the communities together, I don't really have a good answer. I mean, I think it's been tried. I mean, meetings like this, of course, help a lot if the right people are there. So it's also a question of inviting them. I think it's also really a question of funding. I mean, to bridging these, to bridge between these communities and especially between economists and impact modelers, this really is a lot of work. It's a lot of building of concept understanding, of method understanding, and that is hard to do without dedicated projects. If it is done on the side, it's often just sort of falls under the table in the end. The second question on the line between community service and what should be a standard. I think it should be a standard that impacts are somehow included. I don't know if we can prescribe what to include. I mean, that's sort of this question of uncertainty, right? To prescribe you should include this, but not that is in my opinion not possible and also not doable. But we could provide standards of sort of best best practice of how to do it. And I think where we could really provide standards is really on this adaptation question. I mean, that to me is impacts are really depending strongly, I think, on the models. What can you capture? What is your question? So in that sense, it's, I think, in my opinion, but I mean, there may be others, this is hard to do, but to have some sort of standards about how adaptation is captured, at least in the same type of models. I mean, then that would be very helpful, I think. On the GDP metric, I fully agree. I didn't mean, I see now that it comes across like this. This is not necessarily what I meant. I think it's hard. I mean, we have in multiple projects, we have been talking about having other other welfare metrics which take up, for example, HDI components or something. This seems to be, we talk a lot about it. It seems hard to sort of make the step of actually implementing it in sort of then an optimization framework. But I think with these, this complete optimization, like full integration, is only the last step of the line. It may not happen in many cases, and it is not necessary in all of the cases. And I think the steps before that really provide a lot of ways to actually give information on all of the other relevant impacts which would materialize for a given scenario, and for which then in a post-processing approach you could also sort of calculate these kind of metrics and say, okay, this is what the scenario would mean if we also take up, for example, the conflict consequence. And I think for a lot of these type of impacts, there is now the data to do that. And finally, the question of where do we stop when it comes to the level of detail. I think we have to acknowledge that there is always going to be sort of two ends of the spectrum almost. I mean, we will have aggregate approaches which serve aggregate models which serve their point. I mean, I also feel that these cost-benefit models with no sort of detail, they serve their purpose. And then we have something in between, and I think a lot of we have different types of integrated assessment models. Some are still on a fairly aggregate level, others do couple to a detailed, like to LPGA or something, right, to a detailed agricultural model. So there's something in between, but there will always be maybe also cases where we have an aggregate scenario done on a fairly aggregate level where we have to really pragmatically just say this is not what we can resolve, but we can accompany that with a detailed high-resolution study to, for example.
Right, thank you so much for that. Franziska, unfortunately, we're out of time. We're at the 30 minutes, so thank you so much for that. I'd now like to call on Buzz to give us his presentation.
Thanks, and this here.
I can also threaten you with a hug if you go over time, Buzz. So.
Okay.
You remove my whistle.
Yeah, okay. Let's see if I can still talk content after 3 days of process. So, I want to talk to you today about how we keep our range of scenarios under especially the RCPs, but also the SSP-RCP combinations up to date, and how to go about that, what we need to start doing that continuously over time. And standing on the shoulder of a few giants here, because I have, this is material prepared with Brian, K1, Detlef, and Elmar. And I think someone needs to click again so that this clicker works. Up there?
Anyone up there?
Anyone? Uh-oh. Going for a coffee break?
There we go.
Or did we run out of battery here? Okay, good. Sorry. Should not only look up. Good. So one of the recommendations coming out of the last scenarios forum summarized in the O'Neill paper was that we should move towards a continuous reevaluation of the range of uncertainties, and that involves the high emission scenarios as well as the plausibility of the low emission futures. Because on both sides of the range, of course, they should evolve over time. And in this talk, I will focus on the emission part of this range, but this holds actually, of course, for all of the aspects of the SSP. It also holds for GDP and population and any other assumptions that anyone is making in their studies, in that sense, to really still keep them up to date. If we think about this range, I think we should make a distinction between 4 aspects and 4 distinct discussions on where we should keep it up to date. First of all, on the short-term, near-term, basically, the near-term upper end, the question is, what are the impacts of recent policies that we have seen and the recent technological developments on this short-term upper end? And is the original upper end still the one that we need? On the long-term upper end, the question is much more, what is the plausibility of the high call narratives that actually define that upper end of both of the narratives and the scenarios on that side? On the short-term lower end, it's much more into the domain of feasibility and what is feasible and realistic on that short term, and what should we provide to policymakers on that end. And then on the long-term lower end, there is the debate of how far below zero actually can we go, and what is what is there a future that we still find realistic to achieve at some point. And so maybe, oh wait. Yeah. So a few starting points before we dive in. I'm talking here about the community scenarios. So scenarios that are exchanged between the working groups 1, 2, and 3 type communities. So really the SSPs and RCPs. And individual scenarios should definitely not feel in any way bound by any of this and actually explore ranges that they would like to explore individually. One important distinction to make here is I think that the tradition in which we have developed these scenarios over the past decades is really in scenario generation to explore multiple varying futures, to cover unknown risks, to be sort of at the edge of what we consider where we might end up plausibly in a few decades from now, rather than actually the forecasting tradition where we explore the likelihood of a future trajectory and based on the world as we know it today or expect it today. I think that distinction is important between these 2 approaches. And finally, the SSP baselines especially were sort of really meant as a methodological step deliberately without climate policy and climate change impacts, so that you could use them as a starting point in your analysis to analyze the implications of climate policy and the implications of climate impacts. So they deliberately don't include that, and that is an aspect that we should not forget. The baselines are sort of a methodological step. Only once you combine them with policy and impacts become these more integrated scenarios. So then the update and reevaluation is sort of a natural aspect of any scenario process, but we haven't institutionalized that for the SSP-RCP framework. But if we look back and zoom in a little bit on this graph, actually with thanks to Glenn Peters and Robbie Under for giving an update here, you see from the earlier scenarios, starting with the IS-92 towards the SRS, and then in colored bounds the original RCPs, you see how we historically have each time after a scenario framework gets outdated, it gets reconfirmed to or relocked to the actual current situation, and again you start diverging. And so it's very natural at some point that after a scenarios framework is generated that we actually should rebase to the current situation. Also, if we look historically, interestingly, we have been basically since SRS times until around 2015, the Paris Agreement, we've been really at the upper end of the scenarios range that came out of these studies. And the debate also in the literature at that point for 15 years was mostly, are the scenarios not too optimistic? And are we pessimistic enough? And there's a whole body of literature now there from that time on how long-term or short-term trends don't say that much about the long-term future. And luckily, because since the Paris Agreement, more or less, we started deviating from the upper end, and now we can conclude that RCP 8.5 maybe is a bit on the high end. But this has repercussions, right? So once you find yourself now here in 2021, both on the high end and the low end, we have diverged from the actual situation, and we should start reconsidering that. So if we dive into the 4 distinct discussions there. First of all, why do we have community level high-end scenarios? And it is to have, on the community level, be able to assess the impacts and the adaptation needs for very high emissions, so that we know what could be the implications or what we need to adapt to in the highest scenarios that we can plausibly imagine. Also, to assess the consequences of either failing to develop, that was more, I think, originally, but now that we start seeing a lot of climate policy in the real world, it's more failing to actually implement these policies. And because they are promised, they are not necessarily going to materialize in the future as we necessarily expect. And then on the debate on the short-term high end, we see three major trends that have been really influential here over the past 10 years mostly. So for one, technology development has been quite faster than foreseen in the terms of deployment of renewables. We see these, we know these studies where, or subsequent IEA scenarios, but also IM scenarios have been updated because always were overhauled by reality. And this rapid change also we see in the economics of fossils versus renewables. We also seen an increase in policy commitments and the high end in the community scenarios, RSP 8.5 or SSP 585, was designed or is one of those scenarios that is deliberate without climate policies. And so it's a counterfactual scenario in that sense without any climate policy, and the question is whether that is still appropriate actually to use as the near-term high end. And of course, individual events sort of make everything outdated at some point. COVID, now the situation in Ukraine, and God knows what's next around the corner. The debate on the short-term high end focuses a lot on whether that is indeed then really realistic. And the papers that we have seen there tend to make the comparison with to bring it towards the likelihood discussion and say, well, we know actually what's likely. We don't need a scenario to explore a wide range. We know that the IEA, for example, here in the Hausvater and Peters paper from a few years ago, the IEA has put out a number for 2030. Anything if that deviates too far from that, we just label it as unlikely because we know that. That is one approach. I think you need something a bit more systematic than that, but something like that can help you to translate this into likelihood. It still is at odds with sort of what was the original aim for this high-end scenario, which was a high-end counterfactual without any policy. So it was already at the time of selection in the highest 95% of scenarios. By now it's clearly highly unlikely because we have already deviated from it in reality. But in all cases it raises the question, what actually is a realistic near-term high-end in case, for example, in response to the Ukraine situation, we see coal power plants being opened up again in this country this week, but also in more European countries. And does that actually, are we necessarily on that optimistic interpretation that we have taken over the past few years? So we should think of what a near-term upper end could look like in terms of high-end policies. So what can we do to improve our short-term high end? And one thing there that has echoed quite a bit during this conference is regular updates of the scenarios. Really to include these recent trends both in the energy economics and on the policy side, to regularly rebase our scenarios to reality so that we keep track with how the world is actually changing and not every 5 to 7 years only do that. Recent projects have done that. For example, the scenarios for the Network for Greening the Financial System, they have annual releases, but these are all based on SSP2 and don't do it for all 5 SSPs. And that's actually, that's an important remark because it looks already on how for the IEM community that creates these scenarios, this actually is a potentially substantial effort to move in this type of direction, to have these regular updates, because it's a major change in workflows unless you really sort of develop clear, efficient community protocols and information where you can do this jointly on a community level. I think we should have the discussion whether no policy, no impact counterfactuals are actually appropriate to determine the community level high-end scenario, or whether we need a policy high-end case that sort of it fails in implementation maybe, and maybe there's even a failure at some point, but it's not a scenario that starts to diverge on the high end immediately from now on with no policies whatsoever. And And either way, we need much clearer communication between the policy and the no policy baselines. And after me, Elmar Kriegler will actually speak also about that topic. If we look at the longer term high end, there also, of course, recent changes in technology and policy should have their influence on the long term. You would want to see that. So if you do these regular updates, you would expect that the long term is influenced by that. The other debate there is whether the quantification of long-term reference scenarios is correct on the side of economic assumptions about coal and coal mining and the scale at which that could scale up into the future. Yeah, my take is that this is still an open scientific discussion, whether this is correctly or incorrectly implemented, but I think it's important here to make a distinction between the scenario narrative, where a narrative that has a return to coal for certain reasons could be a high-end scenario, but the quantification is another question on whether that's how the energy economics of that actually are implemented and then quantified. Because that raises the question, can we really say that under any plausible future would there ever be a large-scale return to coal in the future? Can we not think of such a world at all? To improve the long-term high-end scenarios, still again stating that RCP 8.5 does not dare represent the likely outcome in the absence of climate policy, and it should not be used for that. It's your really highest percentile emission scenario that just keeps going, quite a stupid, stubborn world in a way, that just keeps emitting. We should have the discussion on whether community scenarios should be defined by no policy, no impact baselines, and whether we should have a community BAU. If we say don't use that high end, then at least identify something that we say, okay, this is a scenario that you might want to use for your impact studies that is being thrown over the fence from the work from the mitigation community towards the impacts community, and say, okay, well, please use this scenario rather than all the time RCP 8.5. Whether the energy economic models for coal resources need revision is a question that we should see, and we should, I think, between the communities have the discussion, because on what plausible high-end narratives still are after all of these years. We see that basically coming out of the SRES A2, it's sort of echoing the same narrative for a long time. And if RCP 8.5 for the real high-end as we have defined it over the past 20 years is no longer a plausible narrative, then maybe something else is. And we should think of what that actually is. Does it have to be this return to coal and high demand, or is it also something about handling badly the stranded assets, coal mine fires, methane cleth rates, anything else that actually just gets us on fossil fuels to levels that we hadn't imagined before. Good, now moving on to the low end. And basically, why do we have these community low end scenarios? It's to assess the climate impacts and adaptation needs in line with the policy targets, right? That's what we on the community level want to do. What are even the impacts and adaptation needs under a 1.5 or a 2 degrees scenario, and to assess what it takes to reach those policy targets. But on the short-term low end, there clearly is, of course, also a sort of a plausibility issue, because at some point, if real-world emission reductions don't take place, many of you might have seen the figure on the right, but at some point you just need to reduce your emissions straight in one line in 1 year if you want to still reach that policy target. And here the question is it up to the scientific community and our models to determine where that limit is, to tell policymakers, okay, now you should forget about 1.5 degrees, or should we paint the broader picture of what it actually takes to achieve that, and then throw as much information as we have in a structured way over the fence to policymakers and say, okay, now you figure out based on this whether you actually think that is still something you should go for and you think is within reach or not. And I think that should be up to politicians and policymakers rather than us here determining that. So one way of thinking about it, one tool that could help with that is the thinking around feasibility that has grown over the past few years. Which are the aspects of the mitigation scenarios that raise these concerns that make them on the bound of actually, if you look at them from as a policymaker, think like, is this, will I implement this or not? What will be the backlash if I implement that and still go for a 1.5 degree target? Is that, so what are the consequences on the, the technological, the economic consequences, the social, cultural, institutional kind of dimensions, right? Where do the scenarios go out of bounds, and provide that information to policymakers so that they can make up their mind about it? So also here, what are our options? Well, for one, again, regular updates, including these recent trends, helps for the low end, but also policies are evolving so quickly that we actually need also regularly updated policy baselines that take that and all these targets into account. And provide these kind of tools to policymakers to be able to actually give the interpretation of the trade-offs and options. Then moving on to the long-term low end. So if we, basically the long-term low end is about how far below zero should we go by the end of century and is acceptable. And this debate also was, basically emerged over the past few years, more or less after the SSP-RCPs were published in their current incarnation. But if we overshoot the target on the short term, we need to compensate that at the end of century, potentially if you want to still, at least at the end of century, reach the same target, you need to compensate for your overshoot. Newer scenarios avoid these overshoots. There is a reason why some projects like Engage actually dominate the Working Group 3 database. I think it's because they did a very large systematic exploration of these overshoots versus not overshoot. But if you follow the red arrow scenario and you have these net negative emissions at the end of century versus the blue scenario, you have a completely different situation at the end of century. These kind of scenarios are not part of the framework at this point, and we should also, when we think of updates, actually see how we bring this in. Good, so what do we need to do to move actually forward here? For one, we need to be more explicit about policies in our frameworks and not just take only RCP, SSP combinations sort of as flat combinations. We need to have the policies in there. Elmar will talk about that immediately afterwards. We need regular updates, and Keivan will actually talk about that after the break. And we had the discussion yesterday. This talk was originally intended for last morning during the power outage on how to keep these ranges up to date in a workshop session. Also, I think we should have, of course, the scientific debate on all of these four aspects, right? On whether the short term, the long term, we should criticize the scenarios out there, but and it should happen in the scientific literature, but it is a communication challenge also to the users and the general audience to have this debate among scientists and at the same time not sort of have that debate in a way that it doesn't reflect on the fact that scenarios are a useless tool at all. And so we know how specific we are on certain aspects, but to communicate that out is harder. And then in terms of institutions, we do have institutions around the updating process. We have the IIASA Scenarios Working Group for the production and quantification. We have basically CMIP and Scenario MIP to select down the 20 cells of the SSP-RCP framework to something that can be handed over to climate models. ICONICS originally was there for the SSP development and updates, but now also as a bridge between the IEM and non-IEM communities. And if we think of updating, especially the narratives of what defines this upper high end, I think we need to do that across communities. It should not be just a single community think about what that is. And there I think we need an ICONICS IMC group to actually think about and have the discussions of what high end scenarios could look like. And then to close, I think we need much more user guidance with the scenarios. We have attempted it often, but it's never succeeded, and we still need to keep trying. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Buzz. We'll take a round of questions for the next 5 minutes. So I see a hand in the back, 2 hands in the back, 1 in the front here, and then 1 over here. So that. Okay, and then
Thanks.
1 here and 1 there. Okay, please make these very quick.
Yeah, Ted Shepard, University of Reading. I'm from the climate modeling community, I think it's important to realize that the climate modelers don't necessarily use the same reasons to run scenarios that you've articulated. And I think the reason the modelers like RCP 8.5 and those of that ilk is they get the biggest bang for the buck in terms of the computer simulation cycles, because they get a strong signal that they can interpret. It's important to distinguish between mitigation and adaptation, I think, because mitigation, there's the emulators, and we're talking about global mean temperature. But on the adaptation side, you've got a lot of natural variability. If modelers are going to try to run low-end scenarios, it'll be large ensembles. They won't get a signal. So unless we tackle that problem, I think it's also a technical, scientific problem. It's not just a policy problem.
My name is Laurens Laurens-Perman from Rocky Mountain Institute. My question goes in a slightly different direction. I hear a lot of the discussions going on about basically about the design of the scenarios, and quite strongly from a modeler's perspective. So from the models that exist, the methods that exist, the kind of thinking that exists, even though I think part of the discussion can also be about the range of methods that are used. Basically, what kind of suite of models, what kind of suite of analyses can you use for what kind of purpose to illustrate basically the outcomes of the scenarios. So part of that answer can be integrated models, part of that answer can be cost optimization, but for other kinds of questions, like basically economic questions that you mentioned, you may need a different kind of suite of models to answer different, basically, types of questions. And I think that can be part of the scenarios debate to basically, basically broaden that perspective of the methods and stories that you use around the scenarios.
Okay, as Working Group 3 co-chair, I just wanted to say I found this a very Working Group 3 focused presentation until we got to the last slide. So just want to say on that, if I was in the impacts, adaptation and vulnerability community, I would absolutely want high-end scenarios. But the high-end scenarios are a product of both the emissions and assumptions about climate sensitivity. And I guess my kind of plea would let's look at the scenario architecture across all the scientific domains and not just start with the emissions side. And I bow to the scientific knowledge of people in Working Group 1 and Working Group 2, but it seems to me a scenario architecture that thought about the whole picture and climate sensitivity as well as emissions might be helpful. Because RCP 8.5 isn't a no policy scenario, it's a reverse policy scenario. And I think that's an important point.
Thank you, Jessica Jewell, Chalmers University. I had two questions. One is, you framed it mostly as that we need a scientific debate on these different ranges. To me, it also seems that there are significant ethical considerations on what scenarios you throw over the fence and what tools you give policymakers to deal with them. And for us in our work in communicating feasibility, we've really tried to shift from this binary understanding of feasibility, and we've really struggled with this. One of the ways we've done it is with working with historical analogies, because it's helped policymakers to understand the effort needed for different pathways. So I wonder if you could reflect on that.
Yeah. This was a very nice summary of the state of scenario development. So your point about it shouldn't be on us to necessarily determine when certain temperature thresholds have been passed. You know, we should just provide as much information as we can and throw it over the fence. What I would add to that is that you also need to, it's not just the fence to the policymakers, it's like these questions of feasibility can't be answered by any single community. So especially on the low end. You know, these internal assumptions about maximum CDR capacity, you know, have to be addressed in a sort of multidisciplinary way because no single model is doing everything at the moment, and you know, that's the state of the science, and we could do better in the future, but that's where we are. And so we need to address this further. And my second point is on the need to do high emission scenarios for the sake of kicking the model strongly. Why not just do a 1% CO2 ramp? I mean, if we want to kick the model, just draw a straight line and kick the model hard. It's not clear that we need an integrated socio-economic scenario associated with kicking the model hard in order to sort of understand the physical processes or train emulators or any of that stuff. That stuff is arguably, it's better done if we take out all of the complicating factors of multiple forces and things like that. That's all.
And the final question in the corner. Good luck, Bas. You've got 2.5 minutes.
They answer each other, so that's good.
Yeah, Volker Kraj, IIASA. Also chiming in on the RCP 8.5 debate. I think keeping that on the radar is obviously important. I would, basically follow up on a couple of the points, including Jim's. We had in the morning, actually, in one of the emulator sessions, an example of SSP3 RCP 7 emissions plus strong climate cycle feedback, carbon cycle feedbacks leading to RCP 8.5. And I think there has been very little attention towards different combinations that can lead towards the upper end of the spectrum. There is tons, I mean, thousands and 10,000s of scenarios that explore combinations that can make the lower end work, including different levels of CDR and whatnot. But very little on the upper end of the spectrum. I mean, you could think of poorly maintained, retired abandoned fossil fuel assets, lots of methane leakage. I don't think any of the current SSP scenarios really go down that route and exploring these types of alternatives on the higher end.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, well, Ben, you actually stole my thunder with exactly that answer to Ted, because I think indeed that's not why we need to come up with a very high scenario on the societal side. We can have 1%, 2% runs for that. On the range of methods, indeed, I agree for many of these studies, there is a variety of methods that you can use. The question is, what is the thing that we need to exchange between communities so that others can use different methods to do their study? And what is the highest and the lowest kind of range in this case for this topic, but there's many other topics where we give things over the fence to another community so that you can use it with other models that have been used originally actually to develop that and can help to explore and do your impact and transition analysis. The whole run up to this talk was rather working group 3 oriented. But I think, given on where we are and where we stand with these scenarios, it is time to have a discussion across the communities, indeed, exactly on what is, on the one hand, can be produced from a working group 3 perspective, but also what is really needed from a working group 1 and working group 2 perspective, and what would actually fill that need, and whether it needs to be a high-end societal change scenario that fulfills that need, or whether we need to do that in a much more stylized way if that high-end societal scenario is simply not that likely or plausible that we actually want to even have it. On the other hand, we do have, in answer to Volker, we do have enough leads in the narratives of the SSPs, I think, to actually explore high methane leakage scenarios, or scenarios in which there is, for different reasons, returns to certain fossil technologies. We just haven't implemented exactly that way, and we might want to actually explore that more in depth to see what that high end could be if we try to push the stupidity in the model, basically. And yeah, feasibility is not binary. I think we shouldn't indeed consider it that way. That's one of the reasons why I think it should not be up to the scientific community also to decide whether a certain climate target is still feasible or not, simply because either a model solves or not. It's about providing that as much information as we can to paint that nuanced picture of why something could be more or less feasible, so that and supporting the policymakers in making up their own mind of what they think then still is feasible. So they can draw their own conclusions and we provide the information to them. I think that's all. Okay.
Okay, I'm hoping that we now get Elmar up on Zoom for his presentation, please. And that's going to be the final one. This was always going to be the transition that I had fear about timing. There we go.
Can you hear me? I'm here on Zoom.
We can hear you. We can't yet see you. Ah, now we can. Ah, we can see me.
Very good.
There we go.
All right. Let me share my screen. Do you see it in full screen mode?
Yes, we do. Go ahead, Elmar. That's great.
Perfect. So I was also a bit afraid of this transition, and I would like to thank the technical people who make it possible for us who have to attend remotely and to at least get a glimpse of this forum. And thanks a lot for their hard work. It's really working out well. So my task is now to look into the dimension of policy relevance of the scenario framework, particularly given the fact that there was a lot of movement on the climate policy side over the last years, and the Paris Agreement is the best example of this. So the scenario framework was already, when it was designed, built around the idea of being used for policy analysis. And it is reflected to some extent in this notion of so-called shared climate policy assumptions that was proposed at the time as part of the framework. And it's often forgotten that this is also a part of the framework, mostly probably due to the fact that when we give it a name, we mostly say the SSP-RCP scenario framework, and we show the matrix of SSPs and RCPs. I think that's still the right way to do, because we know that it's already complex, the matrix, and as soon as we show cubes of 3 dimensions, we would probably lose people to a much larger degree. But still, we as analysts should keep in mind that there is this component of SPAs. So why SPAs? First, of course, if you have a notion of socioeconomic futures, the SSPs, and a notion of climate futures as determined by the RCPs, there needs to be something in between to connect the two, and that is the policy landscape. So some assumptions of climate policies, or the assumption of the absence of climate policy. That's also an assumption. If you say it's a no policy baseline, you're making an assumption about the policy space. Why shared climate policy assumptions? So why shouldn't any modeling team or any analyst group who is designing a scenario just make their own assumptions there? Well, those shared assumptions can be useful in 2 ways. First, if you want to do model comparisons, there's immediately the need to harmonize some of the assumptions, and that includes the policy space. Particularly policy assumptions are harmonized here, ex ante. And then later, if you want to assess the literature, as for example, has been done by the IPCC, we really need to classify these policy assumptions in the scenarios in order to compare apples with apples. So this is an ex post need for developing or identifying shared climate policy assumptions. So the SPAs were proposed at the time, as I said, and let's just take a quick look on what this original proposal entailed. It said that SPAs can consist of 3 components. One component is policy regimes and measures, for example, regulatory instruments, carbon pricing. It can be include implementation limits and obstacles. Those could be constraints to ramp up rates for technologies, could be acceptance issues, barriers related to feasibility. And then there's this third dimension of policy goals, which is bracketed, because if you talk about long-term climate goals, this is of course also part of the RCP component. So including those would not make these 2 dimensions complementary, but there's this idea of excluding those to talk about reduced SPAs and just not including this long-term dimension. Other goals, intermediate goals, like, for example, the 2030 emission targets that are reflected in the NDCs fall squarely into the realm of SPAs. It also said that SPAs should not only be about mitigation, could also include and should include adaptation policies. They can include a policy narrative, giving fundamental notions of this policy framework. Is it cooperative? Is it fragmented? Is it efficient? Is it fair? These kind of notions are quite relevant here, but it can also include quantitative specifications, like the regional distribution of mitigation efforts. There is the option, and it's important to have this notion of the counterfactual case of no climate policy. So that's also an SPA, the SPA 0. And finally, in this original proposal, it was made clear that it can be difficult to really separate out climate policies that you would look at in this SPAs, and then policies, broader policies, societal policies, welfare policies, sustainable development policies that would be embedded implicitly in the SSPs. Now, just to give you two examples that those SPAs were applied in the literature, it's often forgotten that these original SSP-based scenarios produced by IAMs that were later feeding scenario MIP included a notion of SPAs. And here is the table that gives you this brief description. I'm not going into detail. It's just that the two characteristics here are the timing of participation in a climate policy regime with immediate accession of all countries in an SSP1 and SSP4 type world, and then some more delayed accession in the other worlds. And the second component was land use emissions and how it was covered by the policy regime with an effective coverage for SSP1 and SSP5 and a more patchy coverage, particularly for SSP3. And these definitions really are relevant for some of the results we see. For example, the fact that we have late accession and very limited coverage of land use emissions in SSP3 is instrumental for the result that we can't reach a 2-degree or the Paris range with SSP3 type scenarios. On the adaptation side, we have fewer works that use the SPAs explicitly. Here's an example of population developments and migration dynamics in river deltas in the future under climate change. And this looked at different SSPs, different socioeconomic developments in a high RCP 8.5 type changing climate for different assumptions about managements of these deltas. You can see this for examples here. I'm not going into details, just giving you an example that this is also picked up on the adaptation side. Now, taking an assessment here of how explicitly and how often SPAs were used, we probably can say, and I didn't do the numbers as Caspar did yesterday for the regional SSPs. Actually, it would be quite interesting to look into the literature database, scenario database, and see how much SPA, explicit SPA use there is actually. But one can say they haven't been used so much as the other objects. And this was picked up by the perspective led by Brian on needs for the climate change scenario framework looking forward. And one need identified among the 7 in this perspective was to improve use in policy research of the scenario framework. And there were 3 recommendations in this paper. The first one was define and promote the use of SPAs for both mitigation and adaptation, actually picking up on the fact that they are there, that they are sometimes used, but they are not used as often as they could be, and therefore not fully fulfilling their purpose. One element of that is to develop new reference scenarios, including relevant climate policies and impacts, and also make this part of the SPAs. And this is something that is based on the recognition that actually the policy landscape is the fastest moving element in the scenario, among the scenario components. And so it is very useful to have the SPAs as the most flexible unit to pick up these fast moving elements without having to update the entire framework every time. And if you look into the developments or the research in the previous years, we already see an emergence of policy assumptions that are shared across studies between models. And so from the bottom up, new SPAs are emerging in the literature without them being named SPAs. So here I will, on this slide, give a summary of that. So if you look at the original IAM-based SSP scenarios, they made this assumption when we looked into the reference case of no climate impacts and no mitigation policy. So this SPA 0 type of assumption, which is not reflective of what is happening on the ground. And two of those scenarios, the SSP 3 7.0 and the SSP 5 8.5, also went into CMIP 6. Now, if you look into the literature, these new emerging SPAs that capture reference policy cases are called often something like current policies extended. So that's really assuming current policies on the ground and just extrapolate those without adding more. Another one is to take just the NDCs, implement them for 2030 or assume them for 2030, and then extend this level of ambition into the future. Most recently, we see other policy scenarios that are empirically motivated occurring because now countries are giving themselves beyond 2030 mid-century targets, many of them net zero targets. And so we can see how those are built into the modeling to reflect these more ambitious policies. But they are, of course, only targets so far and not underpinned by implementation of policies. I will give you a few examples of those. And we'll just point out that the more data we have on policy proposals on the ground and actual policies, the more we can use those SPAs to reflect this. This is an example of the CD Links project, a study by Mark Rolfsemer, where those new notions of SPAs were used without naming them as such. And you can see on the right-hand side that you have these classic cases, the black one, which is a no policy case. So no policies implemented. Then we have the classic immediate action cases, 1.5 degree in green and 2 degrees. But we already have in this study this current policy case, where it is about extending the current policies on the books into the future. And we can see it's already a little lower than the no policies, but it's not changing the trend. We do have an NDC case where we implement the NDCs. It's basically leveling off emissions. So there is an implementation gap between the current policies and the NDCs. And then we have this large emissions gap between 2 degree and 1.5 degree. And here on the left-hand side, I show you that there's some complexity in trying to formulate these SPAs because it needs a close collaboration between people looking into the policy landscape across the globe, trying to collect those policies, identifying the key policies that are really affecting emissions, and then formalizing this into an SPA so that it can be taken up by the models. Another example are the Ngf scenarios that have now been frequently mentioned. And if you look at the scenario matrix here with the 4 quadrants and the 6 different scenarios, you can see again emerging these current policy scenarios as SPA and the NDC SPA. So that's very similar to CD Links et al. And is showing how the community is converging on some of those. But there are new ones. One is the net zero 2050 scenario in the NGFS that includes country targets for net zero in 2050 and 2060. And this is a new brand of scenarios that were coming too late to be really prominent in the IPCC AR6 assessment of Working Group 3, but I believe in the AR7 assessment will be very prominent. Another new type of SPA, if you want, is this divergent net zero scenario that basically looks at sectoral differences of mitigation action. So stronger action in the oil and gas sector, focusing on transport and buildings, than in the coal, than on coal, which is mostly playing in electricity. And this builds in some of the political economy considerations and builds in the fact that economically you want to be stronger on coal than on oil and gas, but in reality, this might be shifted. And if you compare IAM scenarios with the IEA net zero scenario, you have the same property. IEA is reducing coal not as fast as the IAM cost-effective scenarios, while oil is reduced much more strongly. So, and finally, there's this question, and it was raised by Bas, it was also raised yesterday in the finance session. Do we need another SPA about policy failure here that would populate this quadrant? So you can already see how the space of SPAs is populated now on the mitigation side. Now, I want to talk briefly about one more type of emerging SPAs, which are these so-called bridge scenarios, which are basically asking the question, given the fact that we have this emissions gap in 2030, what can we do until 2030 in order to try to narrow this gap without resorting to this immediate action global uniform carbon price type of setting that we have on the lower end? So that's the red dashed line here, and this is the NDC type development. And one idea is to say, okay, let's think about a global rollout of regulatory policies and only a moderate carbon price here and see what it does. And what you can see in this study is that these policy packages called good practice or net zero with fostering investments into, for example, electric vehicles, are able to close the gap a bit. And this is called bridge scenarios. There's been a model comparison on these bridge scenarios now, and that's the next step in establishing an SPA, I would say, by saying, okay, there are now many models trying to implement this, and it is compared, and then findings are like in this graph that if you look at the bridge scenario in green here, you already have a higher share of renewables until 2030 compared to the delay scenario, to the NDC scenarios, and that is beneficial. So this emerging literature already found a place in the IPCC assessment, not in the summary for policymakers, but in chapter 3, where there was a statement that there's this set of pathways that accelerate action and that reduce annual greenhouse emissions around 3 to 9 gigatons relative to projected emissions from the NDCs, and that reduces the mitigation challenges, particularly lower deployment of fossils, higher deployment of renewables. So this brings me to the other element of actually looking from the perspective of the assessment. So doing a policy categorization ex post after the literature has produced those. And of course, this policy categorization can be done more easily if already in the community there was some convergence around some SPAs. And this is now also reflected in the policy categorization of the AS6 emission scenario database of Working Group 3. So there's not only a climate outcome categorization, but there's also policy categorization. And you see this here on the right-hand side. I list the reference scenarios. I listed the various categories here. So category 1 is really the reference scenarios. And you find these counterfactual no policy scenarios. You see these current policy scenarios summarized here, and you see the NDC's extrapolated scenarios. Then we have this large and still dominant class of immediate action scenarios limiting warming. And they are labeled P2 here. But then we have an interesting class that was very important for the assessment that follow current policies until 2030 or the NDCs until 2030, and then try to reach still some climate target afterwards. And also the few bridge scenarios could already be classified. Now, this assessment or this classification of policy assumptions in the scenarios allows the assessment to make such statements in the SPM by saying, okay, if we project current policies out, we end up at around 2.2 to 3.5 degrees, and do a similar statement for the NDCs, which are also statements that you would find in the UNEP GAP report. There was also a statement on this very high-end class of scenarios that Bas discussed, and this was indicating that it would imply a reversal of current technology and policy trends. So it's from the current perspective unlikely, but also acknowledging that climate factors and feedback factors might lead to such high warming, even though if the emissions are low. A second point here to mention for the IPCC assessment is the use of these NDC until 2030 scenarios, and to contrast them with scenarios of immediate action. So here you can see a view of these scenario classes. In red, you have these trends from implemented policies that are extrapolated to reach 3.2 degrees plus minus into 2100. Then you have the classic 1.5 degree and 2 degree immediate action scenarios, so that are not delaying any action or not going through the NDCs. And then you have this class here in purple, where you have a delay or where you implement the NDCs in 2030 and then still try to reach these long-term targets. So obviously, when you talk about 2030 emissions of scenarios and do it as part of your assessment in the IPCC, you need to separate these two classes. You can't simply say that's a 2 degree class. You need to say, okay, that is the class 2 degree with immediate action, which we call C3A, and that is the class 2 degrees with NDC type action under 2030, which we call C3B. And this differentiation, we could have done even more for other classes like C2 or C4. And I would believe that in the next assessment report, these policy dimensions will play a much larger role, particularly if the focus is on the near term. Now, I would like to use the remainder of my time to just go a step further. And,
so 1 minute, Elmar.
1 minute, okay. To think about extending the SPAs to cover more socioeconomic dimensions relating to sustainable development, like governance and equity. And so there are many elements here, particularly the equity dimensions, that need to be assessed better. And there are examples in the literature that allow us to formulate such SPAs. And let me just give you 2 quick examples. Maybe I have to skip some of the slides, and I apologize for that. So one is a work done by Thomas Hickman, Christoph Bertram et al. In the Engage project, where they try to link governance futures to existing scenarios, and that is particularly then relating to the SPA type assumptions they make. And the variation here is between a revitalized top-down approach, so everybody is joining immediately a regime, up to 2 scenarios where Paris Agreement is implemented and the targets are reached, or whether they are not reached, down to the case of a complete policy failure and Paris is abandoned. And you can then link and see what kind of SPAs we have already in the literature and what not. And the last one I would say, and I'm skipping this part here, and just go to this slide, is that you can explicitly also build in equity consideration into these scenarios, where we do separate the problem of getting from a baseline or reference development to a sustainable development problem into some shifting of socioeconomic pathways and trends. So that's here a shift from SSP 2 to 1. Then we have this climate policy component, which often acts against the goal to reduce poverty, relative and extreme poverty. And finally, there's a policy package assumed that explicitly includes redistributive policies, both internationally and nationally, some differentiation of carbon prices. And you can see that this package then helps to reduce the poverty effects. Last slide, conclusions to finish up here. So the concept of SPAs can be used to formalize these common reference policy assumptions. The SPAs have been underutilized, as I pointed out, and they are particularly useful for capturing this most dynamic element, the rapidly evolving policy landscape. So frequently updating the SPAs is a possibility. And finally, the extension of the SPAs to cover societal dimensions like governance and equity is feasible and desirable, but may require to calibrate the separation of SSPs and SPAs. Thank you. Stop share.
Thank you so much for that and for sticking kind of to time and rushing through those last slides. I'd now like to open up for, I think we've got time for maybe 2 or 3 questions. I see it at the top there. 1 and 2 over there.
Thank you very much, Elmar, for the excellent presentation. I wanted to ask, similar to your slides at the end, how we can better formalize the shared policy assumptions to also emphasize the integrated policy making in energy systems, industrial systems, urban systems, and also delivering the co-benefits, similar to what you showed with the IMP, SP in the last slide. Thank you.
My question still concerns about the differentiation between SPA and SSP, because I continuously confronted with the problem of separating those two kinds of. One thing is how to define current policy and future policy. For example, if we take the goal of climate neutrality, whether we define it as a current when it's already regulated as a binding law, or is it just a political commitment, and what is the current policy? And another thing is about, for mitigation, perhaps it's easier to define what is climate policy, but when we talk about climate adaptation, it becomes much more complex. For example, for land use policy, it might have a spin-off of changing the livelihoods, but the main purpose is about the land tenure. It does not have the aim of dealing with the climate adaptation. So I found those two types of difficulties also, and I saw this Brian O'Neill et al. Paper at Nature Climate Change in 2020, also mentioned about in the context of sustainability, it might not be necessary to separate SSP policy, climate policy and non-climate policy anymore. So I would like to know the update about this.
Thanks very much, Elmar. This is a technical point, so you can probably answer this very quickly. It's something that I think people might like just to have a sort of final solution on, and that is to do with the non-mitigation SSPs that we use for the climate modelling. Now, SSP 3 7.0, does that include climate policy or not? Because I see contradictory information in the literature on that. SSP 5 8.5 I know doesn't have mitigation or any policy, but SSP 3 7.0, can somebody clarify that, please?
Thank you for that. That's unfortunately all the questions we have time for. And there is Elmar to answer them, and then it will be a coffee break, I promise.
Yeah, thanks a lot for those questions. So starting with Tim, it is not including climate policy, the SSP 3 7.0, to my knowledge, but the lead modeler of this scenario is in the room, probably Shinichiro. So if you want to get the details, you can ask him. The question on the integrated policy making and how this can be included in SPAs, I'm not 100% sure I fully got it, but in principle, I see no problem of doing it. I think the step from making policy assumptions in your own study and some emerging shared policy assumptions in the community is a step that is important, and it requires that a larger group of teams is interested in this particular question, and there is some convergence around methods how to identify those policy settings, like we have seen around the current policy. And I think that the question of integrating industrial policy, of energy sector policies, thinking of questions of sector coupling, involving maybe also urbanization questions, I very much can see that the community will work on this and design those SPAs. And finally, this question on separating SPAs and SSPs and how this evolves into a time where we are not focusing so much on climate anymore, but maybe on broader topics. Yeah, I fully agree, and it was already acknowledged in 2014. This is a perennial problem. It's difficult, and I think the question here really is what's the policy question of concern, and so you want to build around the SPA around this policy question, and any other policies that are more reflecting some underlying trends that you assume, that would more be part of this socioeconomic futures assumptions you take, and so recalibrating this every time and as the community evolves is important. I believe in the future, as you have seen already in the last study I showed, this was already a departure from pure climate SPAs. There was already a sustainable development SPAs focusing on inequality. And I think that's probably the future of how this evolves.
Thank you so much for that, Amal. And just a final round of applause for all of our speakers.
Yeah, someone coined the term charming slave driver earlier this week. We need to be back here at 4 so that you can get your buses to airport and station at 5:45 and 6 later today. There are 2 coughing stations, one here in the foyer, one in the oval room, so please use them both, spread out and come back here in 17 minutes, so we start the final plenary.